Part 1. Stampede Days. Chapter 1, Hart Boy. My earliest memory of wrestling goes back to 1960, when I was 3 years old. There were 9 Hart kids then, and we were huddled in the kitchen on a Friday night, watching my dad's TV show on a flickering black and white screen. My mom, pregnant with Ross, it seemed like she was always pregnant then, held my baby sister Allison in her arms. Though back then she never liked to watch wrestling, she, too, was riveted to the TV as Sam Maneker, the wrestling announcer, repeated frantically, "Kowalski has broken Tex McKenzie's neck. He's broken his neck." My eyes popped out of my head and my mouth hung open. I was watching my very first wrestling angle. Tex was a handsome, dark-haired cowboy. I loved cowboys and I was wearing my Roy Rogers holster and six-shooters at that very moment. Killer Kowalski was an agile, bald-headed brute with an angry scowl on his face. Just as I was wondering what kind of man calls himself killer, Kowalski climbed to the top of the corner ring post and leapt off, high and hard, driving his knee into Tex's neck. Now Tex lay there quivering, his cowboy boots shaking and kicking. We watched the ambulance attendants load Tex tenderly onto a stretcher, sliding him out and under the bottom rope. Maneker said Tex might be paralyzed. I asked my 10-year-old brother Bruce, my most reliable source of information, what that meant. Bruce stared hard at the television. "It means he'll never, ever walk again." Suddenly Killer was back up on top of the turnbuckle, and he jumped off and landed on Tex, knocking him off the stretcher and onto the floor. The audience screamed, and the stretcher bearers ran for cover. I was terrified. Kowalski really was a damn killer. It didn't occur to me to wonder why Smith, my oldest brother, who was 12 at the time, had such a big grin on his face. He remarked on how well Tex was selling it. From what I could tell, poor Tex wasn't selling anything. And I couldn't understand why my tender-hearted mom seemed more concerned about how well the match came across on TV than whether Tex would ever walk again. Only much later did I realize that she was happy my dad's TV show was back on the air, they could catch up on the bills again. That night the Hart brothers stayed up into the wee hours of the morning, talking about the match. Even though it was also frightening, it was very exciting too. I was relieved to hear my older brother Dean say that my dad was not only the toughest, greatest wrestler of them all, but that he could tie the killer Kowalski up into knots any time he wanted. Our dad was utterly invincible. I shared a bed with Bruce, who looked after me most of the time back then. When he got up early every morning to milk Daphne the cow, I'd sit on the warm radiator and watch him from the big picture window of the boys' room, walking down past the front of the house in his blue checkered flannel jacket, swinging the milk pail. In the distance, I could see the sprawling city of Calgary glinting in the early morning light and the Bow River winding through the valley. I knew even at that young age that way out there past those lights was New York City, where our mom came from. New York City was where our mom met Stu. My dad was born in Saskatoon in 1915 and grew up in Edmonton in extreme poverty. He managed to lift himself up out of poverty through his drive to succeed and his athletic ability. He spent a lot of time hanging around the YMCA in Edmonton and got into amateur wrestling and football. He was a kicker and defensive tackle with the Edmonton Eskimos in the late 30s. But what he really excelled at was wrestling. When the Second World War broke out, Stu Hart was the undefeated Canadian heavyweight amateur wrestling champion, and if the war hadn't intervened, he might have won an Olympic medal for Canada. Instead, he joined the Navy. When the war ended, he went to New York, where a tough old promoter with cauliflower ears by the name of Toots Mott hired him to wrestle in the New York territory. Being an Olympian was a dream he had said goodbye to forever. But Stu never said goodbye to his dreams easily. He was 31 years old when he met Helen, on a beach on Long Island in the summer of 1946. She was one of the 5 daughters of Harry J. Smith, a famous 1908 Olympic marathon runner, and his Greek wife, who was known to us only as Gaga. Helen married my dad on New Year's Eve 1947, even though her mother didn't care too much for him. It didn't help that all 5 of her girls paid Stu a lot of attention, which he enjoyed. Helen was beautiful and intelligent and could have married someone of higher social standing, but she was smitten with my dad, even though he was a little rough around the edges and she thought wrestling was a dirty business. She quit. We got married in a snowstorm, and I've been snowed under ever since. My dad saved his money, and he and Helen left New York in 1948, headed for Montana, where he started a pro wrestling circuit. During the next few years he bought out and took over all the wrestling businesses around him. Then in 1951 they sold their house trailer in Great Falls, Montana, and moved to Calgary with everything they had, including their 2 boxer dogs, Ving and Demitas, and their 3 young sons, Smith, Bruce, and Keith. Television, a recent invention, was just starting to become widespread. Since wrestling, along with boxing, was easier to light and film than team sports such as football or baseball. It was suddenly very popular on the tube. Across North America, wrestlers such as Gorgeous George Wagner, Luthez, Whipper Billy Watson, Pat O'Connor, Argentina Rocca and Vern Gagne became household names. Mirroring the tensions in the world at the time, the villains were called the Kalmakovs, Fritz von Erich, and Shinji Shibuya. There were midget wrestlers such as Sky Low Low and Little Beaver, a French-Canadian with a mohawk who wasn't even a real Indian. And there were the giants, Haystacks Calhoun, a big, fat farm boy and the former world heavyweight boxing champion Primo Carnera. There were lady wrestlers too. I remember one called the Lady Angel, who was bald and had her teeth filed down to points. In those days most of the ladies of wrestling were anything but beautiful. I never found much enjoyment in watching them drag each other around by the hair. With TV and the start of his big-time wrestling show, my dad had fallen into a gold mine. Throughout the 1950s the Hart family prospered and he bought land. We grew up in a big, red brick, 21-room Victorian mansion high on a hill in the desirable southwestern outskirts of Calgary, with pointy-fin Cadillacs parked all over the yard. In Calgary, Helen had another baby boy, Wayne, and then another, Dean, before my dad finally got what he wanted most of all, a baby girl. Ellie was followed by Georgia, and then me, on July 2, 1957. My dad said that when he saw me for the first time, he looked at my hands, with long fingers like my mother's yet thick like his, and knew I would be the biggest of his sons. I lost my glow as the new baby pretty quickly because Allison soon followed, and then Ross. Ross once climbed all over my mom's desk while she was working and tipped over a bottle of ink, earning him the nickname Inky. Ross never strayed very far away from my mom and that desk. After him came another sister, Diana, and finally my baby brother, Owen. By the time I was born, interest in wrestling had waned, and things weren't quite so rosy at Hart House anymore. My dad had made some poor investments and was barely making ends meet. Then wrestler Iron Mike DiBiase said something bad about Canadians on my dad's TV show. If nickels were brains and 10 cents could get you around the world, the average Canadian wouldn't be able to get across the street. That was all it took for the TV bosses to take big-time wrestling off the air. By 1962, the days of the Hart Boys wearing new hush puppies and matching sweaters embroidered with our first names were over. My parents endured, running live wrestling cards throughout Alberta and Saskatchewan and down into Montana, working a 1,000-mile circuit out of Calgary. But without TV, it was all they could do to hang on. I was 4 when I learned about death for the first time. I was in the kitchen with my mom when someone knocked on the door to tell her that a wrestler called Riot Call Jim Wright had died. Riot Call had looked like a giant version of Walt Disney, and I liked talking with him whenever he came to our house. My mom was upset by the news and, while I tried to comfort her, she explained what death was. She told me Riot Call had gone up to heaven and would never be back again, and that sooner or later everyone dies, including her and even me. God decides when your time is up. Good people go to a good place called heaven, and bad people go to a bad place called hell. She said nobody was really sure that heaven or hell existed. Maybe when you died, it was just plain over. She said she believed in heaven, but that I could believe whatever I wanted. My parents were free thinkers, they never tried to force religion on us kids. Once, when we were given some hand-me-down dress clothes, my parents rounded us up and herded us off to church on Sunday morning wearing suit jackets and ties. It was a parent's nightmare, kids teasing, fighting and crying throughout the service. They never tried it again. I've had little or nothing to do with organized religion, although I've always felt God's presence. Hart House was a cross between a big hotel where the housekeepers had quit, a cat and dog refuge and an orphanage for troubled children. My 5 older brothers spent a lot of time toughening me up for my life ahead. Bruce guided me along, but the biggest influence in my life was the run of the litter, Dean, who was 3 years older than I was. We nicknamed him Biz because he was always up to some sort of business. He was as mischievous as he was dishonest, but I loved him. He was my hero. He taught me to stand up for myself and, above all, to remember that I was one of the Hart Boys. All my brothers were handsome, but Dean was the best looking, with a big white smile and dark brown eyes. I was proud to be his sidekick, especially in the never-ending guerrilla war with the 2 sisters who were right between us in the sequence of Hart kids. Ellie, the firstborn daughter, was the apple of my father's eye. She was small, like Dean, with the same dark hair and eyes, and she had a ferocious temper. Georgia bore a striking resemblance to my dad, with blonde hair, blue eyes and strong chin. Georgia took up for Ellie the way I took up for Dean. You might figure that, with so many unruly brothers, the girls would have had a tough go of things, but my dad thundered to their rescue like an angry bear at the slightest sound of a wail. I spent a great deal of my young life sticking up for Dean, standing my ground against Ellie and Georgia and answering to my dad for it. My dad was a shooter or submission wrestler, and he loved to stretch anyone who dared to show up at his door. I remember him stretching the daylights out of Father Roberts, the Catholic priest who baptized all the Hart kids. Father Roberts got closer to God in my father's basement dungeon than he felt comfortable with. But Stu was non-denominational. He stretched a rabbi once too. The dungeon was a cramped room with sweat and blood-soaked canvas mats covering a thinly padded floor. There were big holes in the low ceiling made by the heads and feet of wrestlers. Stu trained and broke in his wrestlers down there, hooking on like an octopus, squeezing hard enough that the screams of his victims would echo eerily through the rest of the house. I used to wander outside on Saturday mornings with Dean and peer into the window to watch a dozen or so big-necked Goliaths sweating and groaning while they lifted weights and fooled around on the mat, testing each other, until my dad finally came down and pulled on his black trunks. Soon enough they'd be gawking in amazement as he stretched them, one after another. When they were done, they'd shower and drink bottles of the homemade beer Stu stored in the fridge next to the basement shower. He rarely drank himself but made beer for his wrestlers. My mom was tiny, just 5'2", but she was the only one who could make Stu run for cover. She took out her frustrations on him constantly. Sometimes when they'd argue, she'd break down in tears and threaten to leave him and go back to New York. This, of course, meant that she was leaving all of us. She'd pack her suitcase while my dad repeated submissively, over and over, "Please, dear, please." I'd go to bed crying, afraid that she'd be gone forever. My older brothers, long used to these fights, would tell me not to worry, it was just a big act. By the following morning my parents would be drinking coffee in the kitchen and laughing like nothing had happened. This scene played out so many times that I sometimes found it hard to forgive my mom for making such threats when she didn't mean them. At least my dad never talked of quitting on us kids. By the time I came along, my mom had given up on housework. There were always mounds of clothes, broken toys and old sports equipment scattered everywhere, and the kitchen was always stacked with dirty cups and dishes. She was pretty reclusive, I realize now. You could usually find her in one of three places, her bedroom, the kitchen, or the office, where she worked all week preparing ads, doing the payroll and answering the never-ending ring of the two black phones on her desk. Stu was almost always out of town on the wrestling circuit, gone every night of the week to Saskatoon, Regina, Edmonton, Lethbridge, Red Deer and into Montana. Friday night was the Calgary stop, and Saturday morning was my parents' one day to sleep in. When my dad did work at home, he was usually leaning back in his leather office chair with his big forearm across his forehead, talking to some promoter or wrestler on the phone while my mom toiled away at her typewriter. Stu did all the shopping, a little cleaning, most of the cooking, and all of the driving. When my mom was pregnant with Bruce, my parents were in a car accident in Montana that made her afraid to learn to drive. An escapee from an asylum was driving down the wrong side of the highway and crashed into my parents' car. My mom went teeth first into the dashboard and headfirst into the windshield, shattering her Rita Hayworth looks. It took some time before she recovered, and she was so afraid she'd lose her baby that when Bruce was born, safe and sound, she forever had a soft spot for him. Stu survived because of his big, thick chest. Our backyard was an obstacle course littered with old cars, ancient farm equipment, wrestling rings and junk. Wandering around in the midst of it all were Daphne the cow, 2 goats, hundreds of hens and Mighty the rooster, named for the Mexican wrestler Mighty Ursus. Crew cuts, brown shorts and t-shirts were standard summer issue for all the boys. I wore a straw cowboy hat that I rarely took off. Most of us went barefoot, at least until school started. We were always cutting our feet on broken glass, and we were lucky if we were able to scrounge up a bandage. Such things were considered extravagant at Hart House. And we rarely had luxuries such as toothbrushes, unless you count the 2 crusty ones in the boys' bathroom cabinet, along with a tin of tooth powder that had been around longer than I had. I brushed my teeth with my finger. On school days my dad made a big pot of oatmeal for everyone. On weekends it was up to us to feed ourselves. I learned early on to stand on a chair, light the stove with a match, boil eggs, make toast and cut cheese and fruit with a ridiculously large butcher knife. It was that or go hungry. As far back as I can remember, I was called on to defend the family honor. At 3 or 4 years old, I was coached by my brothers in what must have been my first match. I took on one of the tag team champion Scott Brothers kids, who happened to be the same age as I was. Down by the pasture gate where Daphne grazed, we rolled around on top of prickles and cow pies. I lost a close one. Dean and I collected glossy photos of all the top wrestlers of the time. I was fascinated by the toothless behemoth Antonio the Great, with his long, mangy hair and scraggly beard. But I really loved the masked wrestlers, Dr. Death, Mr. X, the Destroyer, and my favorite, the Zebra Kid, with his black and white striped mask. My dad's championship belts were made of gold and silver, with real gemstones on them. My brothers and I made our own belts of gold and silver Christmas wrapping paper, with pieces of broken bottle glass as gems. One day Dean and I were playing in the barn behind the house. He was pulling me up to the roof on a bale of hay attached to a pulley. As I neared the roof, the rope broke and I came crashing down, whacking my head on the brick floor. I lay there groaning in daze as a huge bump began to grow on my forehead. A tearful Dean promised to give me a picture of Antonio the Great if I promised not to tell, so we made up a story about how I'd tripped and hit my head on a rock. Dean was good at making up stories. My parents were worried when they saw the purple blue goose egg, and they fussed over me for several days, but they didn't take me to the doctor. My reward for silence was the prized photo of Antonio the Great pulling a big bus on a chain. A lot of the time it was like a scene from Lord of the Flies around my house, and we were left to our own devices. We were so unruly that the neighbors, and at that time there were only 2 families living close to us in Patterson Heights, rarely allowed their kids to play with us. One of the good things about being from a big family was that there were always enough players for baseball and football games. Now and then my dad would come out and punt a football over the trees and into the neighbor's yard. Smith and Bruce were like pint-sized mobsters, usually up to no good. They seemed to have it in for Keith and Wayne. Stocky Keith had no problem standing up for himself, but Wayne, who was small, was usually made into the fall guy. We all wrestled one another often, and I can remember times when Smith or Bruce inadvertently knocked the wind out of me. Stu would storm in demanding to know who did it, but I never wanted to see Stu get mad at anyone. I'd be bawling my eyes out while trying very hard not to. Then I'd hesitate to answer out of pure fear, and he'd get angrier. Smith would position himself directly behind Stu, glaring at me while hoisting up a closed fist. He'd point across the room at Wayne, mouthing, "Say Wayne did it." Wayne would be playing with his dinky toys, minding his own business. Caught between Dad and Smith, I had no choice but to finger Wayne, who'd look up just in time to see Stu stomping over to throttle him. Smith and often Bruce would both promise me total protection from a seething Wayne. Sooner rather than later Wayne would beat me up, and as punishment they'd beat up Wayne. This was routine life at Hart House. If Wayne was overlooked, he wasn't the only one. Allison, who was the easiest of the Hart kids to get along with, never got anywhere near the love heaped on her 2 older sisters. Like me, she just seemed to operate better by herself. I recall one time being cuffed by Stu and then being yelled at by both him and my mom for something I hadn't done. I decided to punish them by running away. I planned everything out. I lopped off a piece of cheddar cheese, gathered up some apples in a bag and left home around noon, heading west past CFC and Hill, hiking all the way up to Mr. Ferguson's house. He was the school bus driver, and his big yellow buses reminded me of my block of yellow cheese, so I stopped there, stretching out on the dry grass, taking in blue skies and white clouds. I daydreamed, picturing my mom crying and asking my dad, "What have we done?" I imagined my dad, with a grim expression, talking to 2 policemen, one of them scribbling on a pad while the other talked about using dogs to pick up my scent. I wanted them to suffer for being so tough on me, but then I had a change of heart. I thought about Stu's annoyed expression in the daydream, and I knew I was in heaps of trouble. On top of everything else, cheese and apples weren't enough to sustain me. It was a long way back, but I double-timed it, only slowing down when I drew close enough to see that there weren't any police cars or bloodhounds waiting for me. I braced myself as I entered the kitchen. My mom and dad were reading the paper, and the TV was on with the sound low. The table was the usual mess of dirty dishes, except for one giant plate of spaghetti. My mom said, "Hello, darling." Her New York accent was distinct, but Stu didn't look up. Nobody had even noticed that I was gone. I sat down and ate my cold spaghetti, and never thought about running away again. I always looked forward to Sundays. That's when my parents cooked the biggest dinner of the week. After dinner my dad would take us boys down to the basement, and let us wrestle one another, teaching us the basics. Then he would get us to run around in a circle on the mat and, in a strange version of dodgeball, try to knock our feet out from under us using one of his heavy leather medicine balls. I used to love this game and was often the last one standing. Then it was time to hit the shower. Dean and I usually ended up crying because Smith and Bruce would pee in our mouths or blast us right in the eyes, which burned. The best we could manage was peeing on their legs. There was no point telling on them because in the Hart house you were only guilty of something if you got caught. Afterwards, we'd all put on our pajamas and watch Bonanza, which came on at 9 o'clock. I like to imagine we Harts were like the Cartwrights. I was 4 years old when my brothers succeeded in talking my mom into letting me go with them to the Calgary matches, reassuring her that they'd all watch over me. Only the boys were allowed to go. On Friday nights we'd zoom down to what was then called the Victoria Pavilion with my dad in his long black Chrysler Transport limo, which had 4 rows of seats, 4 doors on each side and a big luggage rack on top. He'd give us the wrestling programs wrapped in brown paper, and in the limo we'd all clamber to tear the bundle open. I still recall the smell of fresh ink and the feel of the smooth paper. The older boys would sell the programs, but my first job was pulling lucky numbers out of a big steel box during intermission. That job was short-lived. Soon, I was replaced by cute, curly-haired Inky. After that I earned a few bucks a week selling programs. That's how I learned how to count. But more importantly, that's how I learned that if I really hustled, I could earn enough money to buy toy soldiers or cowboys and Indians. During the winter it was tough work standing in the bitter cold. And as soon as Ross grew old enough to start selling programs, he cut into my market because the fans liked to buy from the smallest Hart kid. I met all kinds of crazy characters, real cowboys and real Indians, big, fat, friendly older women, and a few younger ones who smoked cigarettes and were dolled up in red lipstick, cheap perfume and high hairdos, squeezed into short dresses and fishnet stockings like cut-rate versions of Marilyn Monroe. And there were even younger ones who my dad referred to contemptuously as arena rats. But I kept my thoughts to myself, remembering a saying Bruce taught me, all the world loves a lover and that's why the world loves me. I thought, yeah, that'll be me someday. During the matches, Dean and Ross and I would sit at the timekeeper's table at ringside. Sometimes my dad had really interesting attractions. I recall Cowboy Carlson climbing up and down a ladder with a horse slung over his shoulder. At least once a year, Terrible Ted the Wrestling Bear came to town for a couple of months. Terrible Ted lived in a mesh cage under our back porch. Dean, Ellie, Georgia and I would dangle our bare feet through the slats in the porch steps and drip fudgesicles on our toes for Ted to lick. Once I was invited to a neighboring kid's birthday party. His parents took us just up the hill to the CFCN TV studio to attend a live kids program called The Headhunter Show. Out came Ted, playfully wrestling with Jean Dubois, his handler, to help publicize that week's wrestling show. After Ted had been led away, Headhunter came around asking all the kids questions. Strangely enough, he asked me whether I wished I had a bear like that in my backyard. Of course he had a great laugh when I insisted that, in fact, I did have exactly that bear living under my back porch. He kept winking at the camera until I actually got annoyed with him. My mom gave me the biggest, sweetest hug when I got home. She'd seen the whole thing. You were so right, darling. At least you tried and you never backed down. When Dean and I got bored at the matches, we'd go out to the front of the pavilion, where there were always lots of kids from the nearby neighborhood of Victoria Park. The kids were as poor as we were, so we blended right in. We'd wrestle them on a small patch of grass, and Dean was always quick to boast that we were Stu Hart's kids, but no one would believe him. We'd take our shirts off and an hour or so later we'd be drenched in sweat, having taken on all comers, one after another. I never lost one of those matches, and neither did Dean. It's as beautiful a memory as wrestling ever gave me. When the show was over, my dad would bring the car around front and honk the horn, and we would scramble to get in. The Victoria Park kids would look on and wonder, wow, they really are Stu Hart's kids. On the drive home I looked forward to the jello or chocolate pudding that my mom, Ellie and Georgia always had waiting for us. Sometimes on the way home my dad would slow down and point at a giant chandelier hanging in the window of a lighting store on 11th Avenue, saying how he wanted to buy it. I think everyone in the car was dreaming about what they wanted in life. I was happy on these drives simply because my dad was happy. Being a middle kid was like being stuck in nowhere land. Smith was a bully who didn't want to grow up, much as my parents tried to mold him in being our leader. I could never figure Smith out, and only in the last couple of years did one of my mother's sisters fill me in on what had happened to Smith before my parents moved to Calgary. When Stu and my mom had that near-fatal car accident, Gaga took Smith so that my mom would have time to recuperate. But then she wouldn't give him back. She and Mom's 4 sisters doted on him and spoiled him until he was 4 years old. When they were about to move to Calgary, Stu decided that enough was enough and demanded that Gaga give Smith back. But she still refused. Stu had to drive all the way to New York to get him. That would have been an abrupt change in Smith's life, going from being doted on by 5 loving women to living in Stu's world of discipline, with 2 little brothers and another sibling on the way. When we were kids, all we knew was that for some reason, we weren't likely to see Gaga or our aunts. Our only contact with them was the family Christmas card, including a photo that my mom sent back east each year. Bruce, on the other hand, was sometimes too clever for his own good. He was a tremendous influence on me, teaching me all about sports, Mickey Mantle, Babe Ruth, Johnny Unitas and Gordie Howe. He also taught me the Lord's Prayer and added to my sense of what God was, and then balanced it out by also teaching me all about girls. At night I'd go through his yearbook with him and pick out the prettiest ones. I wasn't fussy. I loved blondes, brunettes, and redheads too. Dean had a vivid imagination and was fascinated by cars and by characters from the Old West, especially Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, General Custer, and Wild Bill Hickok. He encouraged me to be charming to girls and taught me to kiss, using our pillows as imaginary girlfriends. One day he was playing up on the abandoned, closed-off top floor of the house with a toy campfire set he'd been given for his birthday. It came with plastic frying pans, plastic logs, and a fake fire. Around 3 in the morning my mom woke us up one by one and calmly told us not to panic, and to follow her outside because the house was on fire. We walked behind her in a line, with blankets wrapped around us. Looking up I could see a smoldering red square on the ceiling. Dean had started a real fire up there and, unable to put it out, he'd pushed a big old mattress over it thinking that would smother it. In the frigid January night we all stood huddled with my mom, watching the growling red fire trucks and the firemen hosing down the roof. Stu was out of town but due back in the morning, and every one of us knew there was going to be hell to pay. As soon as he walked through the front door, Stu ordered everyone upstairs to the attic and angrily told us the dangers of what might have happened. Then he grabbed Dean by the hair and hurled him headfirst down the stairs. I was terrified. Then, because he'd caught Bruce and Wayne playing with matches only days before, he snatched both of them and threw them down the stairs for good measure. As they tumbled, I prayed I wouldn't be next. Eventually Smith, Bruce, Keith and Wayne were all moved out of the boys' room and up to the attic after it had been repaired, to prevent them from poisoning the minds of their little brothers, but by then it was already too late. Every year back then my dad would close down the wrestling circuit for the summer in mid-July. At the time, the annual Calgary Stampede was called the greatest outdoor show on earth, and each July people from all over the world flocked to the fairgrounds. There were cowboy hats everywhere, Ferris wheels and roller coasters, the smell of cotton candy mixed with the stink of manure. While the rodeo kicked off next door, my dad ran his biggest show of the year, a supercard on par with the biggest midway attractions. In 1964 he brought in the newly crowned Worldwide Wrestling Federation world champion Bruno Sammartino, who'd only just defeated the great nature boy Buddy Rogers, rated by many as the best wrestler of all time. Stu also brought in the undefeated boxing champion Rocky Marciano to be the special guest referee for the main event. After the Stampede parade, all of us Hart kids were posing alongside the big, long transport limo with Marciano when a tiff broke out between Dean and Ellie. Stu cracked Dean hard on the ear just seconds before the photo was taken, yet we all look happy in that picture, even Dean. I'd learned years later that Marciano was a horrible cheapskate. When he left town he intentionally misled Stu into writing him 2 checks, each for the whole fee. Even knowing how badly my dad needed the money, he cashed them both. Despite my dad's attempts to get him to send the money back, he never did. About a year later, Marciano died in a plane crash. My mom didn't shed any tears. That year my dad gambled whatever savings he'd scrimped together to purchase a 160-acre man-made sandbar called Clearwater Beach, 7 miles outside of the city. The idea was that it would help him make ends meet in the summers, when he shut down his wrestling territory. Clearwater Beach consisted of 2 man-made lakes, picnic tables, barbecue pits, a canopied dance floor and 1 concession building. The idea was that the Hart kids would work out there in the summer, and then a new and better batch of wrestlers would arrive to turn things around when my dad's circuit started up again in September. The beach became a horrible place for me. Far too often, it was my responsibility to man the dreaded toll booth, no wider than a telephone booth. I'd sit out there for countless hours, barefoot, in cutoffs, swatting horse flies and collecting $5 a car. I often had $300 or $400 crammed into my pockets, and it's no small miracle that I wasn't robbed, out there all alone. Sometimes it was just too much for me to take, sitting all day in the heat with no bathroom, water or food. It was about a 5-minute walk to the concession building and the lakes, where I'd find most of my older brothers swimming and splashing around pretending to be lifeguards, flirting with girls, never once giving any thought to their promise not to leave me out at the booth. One morning Stu loaded us all up in his latest acquisition, a beautiful round curved purple 1959 Hudson, and drove us out to the beach, and I complained all the way there that I didn't want to go back to the booth. Of course, when we got there, Wayne immediately ordered me back to the booth. When I angrily refused, Stu grabbed me by the hair and flung me into the back seat of the car, busting my forehead open just above my right eyebrow. On the drive back home, I pressed my t-shirt to my eye to stop the blood from dripping all over his new car. He asked me to please not say anything to my mom and, feeling sorry for him, I promised I wouldn't say a word. He asked me what he could get for me to make up for splitting my head open. I told him a bike. I was the only brother who didn't have one yet. As soon as we got home, he told my mom exactly what had happened anyway. As always, there wasn't a bandage to be found, so my dad used scotch tape to hold the 2-inch gash on my forehead together. Then we left to go to the doctor. On the way, Stu stopped at the house where the producer of his TV show lived and said he had to go in to talk to him. So I sat in the hot car, hanging my head out the open window. 3 hours later, Stu came out and took me for my stitches. As for the promised bike, he bought it for me 7 years later. Tough times were ahead, and after his meeting that day, I was the least of his problems. Life at school was an entirely different, drearier kind of hell. Hart House was a terrible environment for studying. Because Smith was so much older, my mom would volunteer him to help me with my homework. He was no scholar, so his method consisted of him knuckling me hard on the head when I didn't know the right answer, which was more often than not. In time I realized it was smarter to follow Dean's approach and lie to my mom about even having homework. In fact, I learned to just lie whenever it made things easier. At Hart House, a lie was only a lie if you got caught. My dad was generally late for everything, and he passed that trait down to us kids. When we missed the school bus, which was most of the time, he would load us up in the transport limo and race us off to school, skidding to a halt on the gravel parking lot of Wildwood Elementary. All the doors would fly open and a handful of Hart kids would pile out just as the bell was sounding. Then the car would take off again, throwing more gravel on the way to the next school and the next. My grade 2 teacher, Miss Michaluk, reminded me of those pretty ladies at the wrestling matches. She wore nylons and dresses, and even at that age I felt an uncontrollable urge to look up her skirt. One day she announced to the class that there was going to be a school play and we would dress up as elves. She told us to bring green leotards to school. Now I had a kind of phobia not only of leotards, but of bras, panties and stockings. Whenever my pants were intertwined with Ellie's or George's leotards in the big clothes dryer at home, I cringed at the thought of even touching them. I was sick at the notion of pulling those horrible things on. Every day Miss Michaluk reminded me to bring my green leotards, and every day I purposefully forgot. Finally, she ordered me not to dare show up without them. The next morning when my dad herded us into the limo, I lagged behind, pretending to be sick. Stu demanded to know what the hell my problem was. I broke down in tears. I don't want to wear leotards. I pleaded my case on the way to school with little hope, but after we pulled up, my dad climbed out and came with me to see Miss Michaluk. When he told her how strongly I felt about wearing leotards, she said, "You'll regret this, Brett. You'll have to sit out the entire play." I was happy my dad stuck up for me. Little did I know that someday I'd make my living wearing leotards, pink ones at that. It was around that time that I took up drawing cartoons, probably the only constructive thing Smith taught me. If I couldn't have the toys I wanted, I'd draw them instead. With my tongue twisting up over my top lip, I drew Frankenstein vs. Werewolf, and Wolf and Montcalm on the Plains of Abraham, but what I always drew best were the ugly faces of my favorite wrestlers. I was torn between Snoopy and the Red Baron, between Hogan's Heroes and Waldo von Erich, a bald-headed wrestler who was terrorizing my dad's territory as a pretend Nazi thug. Waldo billed himself as a brother of another supposed Nazi, Fritz von Erich. 30 years later, Waldo laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world when he told me about a joke he'd pulled on my dad. He'd stolen Daphne the cow and sold her to a slaughterhouse. Then he generously presented Stu with a rack of beef, saying a farmer friend had given it to him. With my dad having so many kids, he said he wanted him to have it instead. Poor old Daphne. Some joke. In 1963, my sister Diana was born, a breech delivery that was really rough on my mom. The doctor had insisted that Diana be Helen's last child. But my mom was as stubborn a heart as there ever was, and made up her mind to have just one more, to make it an even dozen. In May 1965, my mom came home from the hospital with the last Hart baby, my youngest brother, Owen. Ellie and Georgia raced to get home so they could see him first, but I overtook them in the final half mile, bounded up the steps, and was the very first Hart kid to welcome Owen Hart into the fold. From the moment I saw him, I wanted to be the best brother to him he'd ever have. As soon as he was out of the crib, Owen was taken in by the girls, and he lived in their room until he was 3. He looked like the little bird Woodstock from the Peanuts cartoon, with a beaky nose, a tuft of blonde hair and big blue eyes. Living with Ellie and Georgia, Owen became quite the tattletale, telling on the boys for everything. Then one night my mom casually announced that Owen would be moving into the boys' room. Panic washed over his face, and his eyes grew wide. Dean and I glared over at him, and he knew exactly what those glares meant. A few hours after Owen's bed had been moved, a heated argument broke out between Dean and Ellie. Stu was out of town, so my mom intervened, demanding to know who started it. Little Owen stood, holding his blue furry blanket, and said matter-of-factly, "Ellie started it, Mom." It was true. But more importantly, it was smart. He won over all the boys in an instant. Welcome to the club, brother. Much like Bruce had taken care of me, it became my responsibility to dress Owen, comb his hair, tie his shoes and teach him how to be a Hart. That summer of 1965, at my dad's Stampede show, I'd watched the smooth and graceful former champion Pat O'Connor take on Gene Kiniski, a wrestler whom Stu had started out years before and who was the current National Wrestling Alliance, NWA, world champion. Since 1948, the NWA had been an affiliation of North American wrestling promotions who voted every year to pick one wrestler as the NWA champion, a fellow who could really draw, and then let him defend the title in all the territories. I was fascinated by how real the match scene, but at the same time I wondered how it was possible for someone to do this or that move or break that hold. Without knowing it, I was making a thorough study of pro wrestling. But I was failing at just about everything else. Once my dad had shut down for the season, my focus became surviving another summer out at Clearwater Beach. Dean had an extra bike, obtained through questionable means, that he let me ride on my own, as far as I could go. After we got back home from the beach, or on rare weekend days at home, I'd get on that bike and take off. It was my first taste of freedom, my escape from everybody at the house. I found that I enjoyed being alone with my daydreams about cowboys, soldiers, girls and wrestling, away from the noise and fighting. I generally did all that I could to avoid Ellie and Georgia. The biggest problem in my life at that point was how easily I was drawn into Ellie's ongoing quest to see Stu punish me for being born. Feisty and hot-tempered, Ellie regularly managed to provoke fights with me in which Stu usually intervened on her side and administered a shit-kicking to me. On top of that, Georgia, her loyal supporter, couldn't resist tattling on me, which also got me into trouble with Stu. I also tried to stay clear of Ross, who was a strange little fellow. He had problems with his ears and had to have tubes put in, which automatically excluded him from Stu's punishing left hand. He was very smart and could read the entire lineup on the back of the programs when he was still in diapers. He had a stubborn temper and hated to lose at anything, which was tough on me, because when I was growing up I'd been made to understand that little brothers were supposed to do what their big brothers told them to do. Ross wouldn't answer to me or to anyone else, and if you got into a conflict with him, he would never back down. Dean felt much the same about Ellie and Georgia as I did. A fight with either of them would cost us severely. We distracted ourselves by playing a lot of football and baseball with the McDonald kids, Johnny, Karen and Cameron, who lived next door. The hatchet was much easier to bury when we needed the girls to help make up teams. These games are easily my favorite memories of growing up, an escape where I found team spirit, order and rules that made sense. The last weekend of the summer before school started, my dad arrived home with boxes of apples, bananas, oranges and all kinds of vegetables tied to the roof of the car. Safeway regularly gave him all the distressed produce he could take. I eagerly helped unload the heavy cardboard crates, stacking them under the porch where the bear used to live. I couldn't have been happier lifting all those boxes of nice yellow bananas. I loved bananas. When we grumbled about hand-me-downs and such, my mom would speak of how tough times had been for my father when he was a kid living in poverty with his two sisters and his parents on the unforgiving Alberta prairie, sometimes with only a canvas tent and an open fire to keep them warm, eating rabbits and birds that Stu hunted with a slingshot. My paternal grandmother had died before I was born, and Stu never talked about his sisters. We never met any of our aunts. The only link to those times on the prairie was Stu's father, Edward, who'd had nowhere to go, and had recently moved into a room next to the gym in our basement, together with his Dalmatian, Zero. My grandfather was nice enough to me, but he was a religious zealot and perhaps a bit nutty. He used to take his dog on long walks of 30 miles or more. His attitudes and habits drove my mother crazy. Stu kicked off the new wrestling season with a better crew than he'd had for a while and with a new TV show, Wildcat Wrestling, which aired on Saturdays. He had started major renovations on the house, but they were left unfinished when the money from Clearwater Beach fell short that summer. The brickwork around the big picture windows was missing and the old house grew colder as the days grew shorter. At night I'd go looking for one of our many cats to put under my blanket as a weight to keep warm. There was a new villain working the territory, one who would make a lasting impression on me. Sweet Daddy Siki strutted into the ring with snow-white hair and white sunglasses, a black Adonis in white trunks with red pinstripes and a fancy red sequined robe. He carried 2 white hand mirrors just so he could admire himself. He was too handsome, too smart, too cocky and too cool. He was also an innovator and a great showman. Reggie Siki out of Houston, Texas, was probably a bigger influence on Muhammad Ali than Gorgeous George, whom Ali would later credit as being his greatest inspiration. But Sweet Daddy Siki was also deeply influenced by Gorgeous George, so I guess it all comes to the same thing. Later, Sweet Daddy would tell me that he was the first black man to wrestle for the NWA World title against Nature Boy Buddy Rogers in Greensboro, South Carolina, back in the 1950s. The Ku Klux Klan had ringside seats for the fight. They all stood up in unison, arms crossed, letting Siki know he'd never walk out of the building as world champion. Sweet Daddy feared for his life that night. He was wrestling as the babyface, or good guy, and the ref told him not to even think about closing his hand into a fist. Siki let Rogers call every move and take the whole match too. This wasn't just wrestling, it was a matter of life or death. I remember crowding close to our old black and white TV, which had a bent coat hanger for an antenna, watching Stu's new ring announcer, Ed Whalen, introduce Siki. Whalen was tall and slender, balding on top, wearing black framed glasses and a nice suit and tie. "Ladies and gentlemen, do not adjust your sets," he said dryly. In the interview that followed, they both played their roles brilliantly. Siki talked about driving all the ladies insane, then denounced a local favorite named Dave Rule, a black-bearded, pot-bellied version of Ulysses S. Grant, who was the territory's version of a Canadian champion. Rule was billed as being a farmer from Hanna, Alberta. He was as respected as any wrestler who ever worked for my dad, not so much for his mat skills, but because he came across as a salt-of-the-earth guy in whom fans in Alberta and Saskatchewan desperately wanted to believe. In those days, our fans were likely to be farmers, ranchers, and laborers who needed to let their aggressions out by watching a form of staged violence. From the early days of pro wrestling, these fans had been educated to believe in the strategies of varying styles and finishing holds. Rule's finish was a basic, boring full Nelson, a submission hold that I never saw get over anywhere else. But in Calgary, the fans had no doubts once Rule had it on you, you were finished. The person who puts together the matches and determines their basic content, how long the match will last, who will win and what the storyline will be, is called the booker. Stu had the final say on booking the territory and was always in charge of his wrestlers. When a wrestler got disgruntled or angry, my mom had a way of sweet-talking him back into the fold. At the time, Dave Rule was Stu's pencil. He could write guys into the storyline, or just as easily erase them. Throughout my life in wrestling, I never once saw a script for a pro wrestling match. It was up to the wrestlers to figure out how to tell the story that the booker wanted. The booker only controlled the last 3 seconds, the finish. Good booking is essential to the success of a promotion, no matter how talented the roster is. Fan enthusiasm is heightened by combining athletic skill with a dramatic story that is exciting and plausible. For fans to willingly suspend their disbelief, they have to think that what they're watching could be real. Every week, as Sweet Daddy ridiculed Rule, calling him a pig farmer and a chicken plucker, humiliating him by blindsiding him in match after match, eventually leaving a dead chicken tied around his neck, Stu's business got better. At long last, while Whalen was interviewing Siki, a furious Rule hit the ring like a tornado, and the pavilion came unglued, exploding as everyone rose to their feet to watch the pig farmer, goaded beyond reason by the arrogant black pretty boy. Spilling out onto the floor, Rule chased after Siki, tore the robe off his back and peppered him with lefts and rights. Stu was in the middle, acting out his part, trying to keep control. Barely noticeable were the 2 young Hart Boys, Dean and I, trailing the action. Dean snatched the sequined robe from the floor as swarms of hands tried to yank it from him. This was Sweet Daddy Siki's costume, worth more than gold. Whalen declared in his usual nasal near-panic pitch, "There's absolute bedlam in here." The following Monday, Dean brought Siki's torn-up robe to school, and all the kids clambered over one another just to touch it. Wrestling was cool again, and more importantly, so were we. A month later, I had a freckle-faced kid named Brett McFarlane clamped in a headlock out in the field by the soccer posts at Wildwood School. He was a grade above me and bigger than I was. I still don't know what his problem was, but he kept making fun of how poor I was, wearing pants with knees that had been patched so many times that my dad couldn't patch them anymore. He wouldn't stop pulling my tail. Once I had him, I didn't want to let him go, and he wouldn't give up even though his face was scarlet. In the distance I heard the sound of my dad's car horn. I flashed Dean a worried look. He scanned the street in front of the school. "Keep going, it's not him." But we both knew that horn and who was pushing it. I wrenched McFarlane's head, ordering him through clenched teeth to give up. "No way," he fired back. Dean finally made the decision, "We'd better go." I released the hold, and the 2 of us took off toward the front of the school. I could hear McFarlane yelling, calling me a chicken shit. Tears welled up in my eyes, and Dean comforted me. "We both know you had him, don't worry, Brett." When my dad asked what happened, Dean said, "Brett got into a fight." My dad caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "How'd you do?" I didn't know what to tell him. He was far more intimidating than that kid. Finally, Dean told him that I had the bigger boy, but that we broke it off when he got there. At home, Dad took me aside to give me some pointers. First, take him down, and never forget this important rule: where the head goes, the body follows. If you find yourself in a real bind, pull him in close, like you're gonna kiss him, and use your back teeth if you can. Bite him right on the tip of the nose. He won't bother you too much after that. Then he said, just remember who you are, Brett. He stroked the top of my head with his hand, and I knew then just how much I loved him. Behind our house was a carriage house that my dad rented out to an artist, Katie O. She had a studio and barebones living quarters in there, but she traveled a lot for her art and so was often not home. She had a white Volkswagen Beetle that seemed like it was intimidated, being parked among the black-eyed, bloodied Cadillacs all around the yard. One morning it was so cold that my dad loaded everyone up in one car after another, and each one sputtered and died as he turned the ignition key. With an exasperated Christ Almighty, Stu slammed his fist into windshield after windshield, teeth bared and eyes ablaze, leaving spiderweb cracks in the glass. Finally, he stuffed us into Katie's Beetle like so much cordwood, and we all fought to suppress giggles as he ground the gears all the way to school. In December, my dad realized he couldn't patch the holes in our jeans anymore and ordered Dean and me to wear pathetic brown Boy Scout shorts to school. It was 30 below zero when we climbed out of the limo, embarrassed as we stood in the cold with our pale white legs. By the end of the week, Stu had rounded up some horrible green pants with elastic in the waist, known to the kids at school as twangs. We might as well have worn a sign, too poor for real pants. The best place to get warm was at the pavilion on Friday nights. I felt at home there because the other kids were just as poor as I was. Sweet Daddy Siki continued to draw big crowds for my dad for a while, even taking on Terrible Ted the Wrestling Bear, one night. But there was never enough money. One day my mom got so angry that she stormed down to the basement and threw a shoe through the window of the room my grandfather Edward lived in. For a reason known only to himself, my grandfather was suing my dad over some property in Edmonton that was never his in the first place, even while Stu was letting him live in our house and knowing that my dad could barely feed and clothe his kids. When he eventually died, Edward Hart left a small fortune to the Oral Roberts Ministries. The bank was forever foreclosing on Hart House, and every time the bank's for sale sign went up in front of our place, my dad would take it down and hide it,